soon, which will be free, which is called Collaborations, which is basically collecting together lots of the work I've done with other people over the years. It includes the unexpurgated version of the foreword to the Hickel book, Less is More, because the press actually made some cuts in it, which we wish they hadn't made. And then the book I've got coming out this summer with Bloomsbury Press is Why Climate Breakdown Matters. Obviously also relevant to, very relevant to what you guys are doing in this book club. Why Climate Breakdown Matters is really my argument that if we are actually to take the climate crisis seriously, we need to go deeper into the horror of it, that the way out is the way through, that where the danger lies, there also the saving power lies, as the German poet Hölderlin once put it. So the first half of the book is basically taking people deep into the horror of our situation and an unstinting prognosis of what it involves. And my suggestion is the way forward out of that is to go even deeper into the trouble. So I've got a chapter on how climate disasters could be the making of us, because climate disasters, in relation to them, we will find new community spirit and find a greater spirit of cooperation. That's been the history of what's actually happened in disasters for many centuries, that rather than everybody becoming sort of Hobbesian brutes, people actually cooperate and show love and effect change through disasters. And there's a chapter on how terror and grief and anger that come to us from the eco-emergency are going to be also part of our salvation. How ecological grief is really a form of love for the planet and love for each other, and how we have to be willing to face that grief and feel it fully, and how that can actually help us get through. And there I'm drawing on my teacher, Joanna Macy. And finally, a chapter on how we need to confront what we're doing to other animals. And the more we confront that and the full horror of that, the more likely we are to change course. So that's basically the way that Why Climate Breakdown Matters works. Yeah, perhaps Paul, that's enough. And if you or anyone present has any questions about either of these two books in Prognosis, I'd be very happy to briefly respond to them.
So if anyone wants to raise their hands with the reaction tool at the bottom. Oh, Anna, I'd like to ask a question.
Hi, thanks for joining, Rupert. One thing that I've always felt kind of less optimistic about is having read about terror management theory and people's response to their own mortality sort of becoming more nationalistic, these sort of tendencies to clinging to your own group, and so I'd be interested, how you think that interacts with, maybe your more positive view of our reaction to, the confronting our own mortality in the face of climate disasters. Yeah,
great question. So I'd say two things. Firstly, I'd say that there is some empirical evidence to back up terror management theory. And there's also quite strong empirical evidence behind the stuff that I've been saying. For example, the stuff around climate disasters. Some of what I write in that chapter is drawn from a book that some of you may know. If not, it's a book that you might want to read in your club, because it's a tremendous book. Rebecca Solnit's book, The Paradise is Built in Hell, which is an incredible title. And basically what she's saying is, look, if you look at the actual history of natural disasters, then you do find this extraordinary history of them leading to positive political change, of them leading to people pulling together. This was first crystallized for me in a remarkable experience I had in New York soon after September the 11th. I was speaking with an activist friend in New York, and I said to him, God, it must have been the most awful time going through that terrifying attack. And then so many people kind of in response to the attack being whipped up into a vicious kind of patriotic frenzy and wanting to go and bomb Afghanistan and so on. And he totally surprised me with his reply. He said, you know what, it was actually one of the best times in my life, because for the first time in my life, New York felt something like a community. People actually talked to each other. People actually helped each other. You know, New Yorkers are famously, and I experienced this when I used to live in New York, New Yorkers are famously kind of brusque and unfriendly and supercilious and so on. He said all that changed for the duration of the disaster period. And I was like, wow. And that connected for me when years later I read Solnit's incredible book, charting the history of these things. So that's one thing I would say. And, you know, obviously there's more in my book about that. The other thing I would say is, I think you just have to look at what's happened in the last few years and look, for example, at the phenomenal success that was enjoyed in 2019 by Extinction Rebellion. So when we launched Extinction Rebellion, a lot of people said to us, including a lot of communications experts and psychologists, they said, this is going to be a disaster. You are setting yourselves up for a terrible fall. No one's going to get behind something with the word extinction in the title. It's just going to turn everybody off. Everybody's going to be unwilling to think about their mortality, the mortality of their species, etc. And they were completely wrong. And thank God we didn't listen to any of them. So if Extinction Rebellion can pull off that kind of success, that suggests to me that if you get the framing right, and if you have things like a regenerative culture, and if you don't blame and shame, and if you create a kind of supportive context for people with each other, then it's quite possible to get past those kind of initial kind of unwillingnesses to look at mortality, etc., and enter into a space which is much more, well, ultimately positive.
Great, thank you. I see, Sue, you have your hand up.
Okay, thanks. Two things. One, to support what you were saying, I went to New York in 2019. I couldn't take part in the October Rebellion, and I went and joined, so I was visiting my son in New York, and so I thought I'll join XR there. And it was quite extraordinary because the welcome, the feeling of being at home, the feeling of being with people, because of the procedures and the practices and the care for each other, and that time taken to build community together. It was absolutely fantastic. And it was just amazing to see how it moved from Britain to New York. And it was huge. It was a hugely successful uprising there.
Yeah.
So that gives me hope. I wanted to ask you whether or not, just recently, for those of you who are not from the UK, you may have similar experiences. 45, well, the government said, is there anyone who'd be prepared to offer a place in their home to a Ukrainian refugee? And 45,000 families within 2 days have said, yes, we'll take a refugee. And the government, I think, was really taken aback because it sort of built its Brexit on the assured xenophobia of British people. And I just thought that maybe you would see that as a way of supporting the argument you were just making.
Yes. Yeah, I think you're right. So on the first point, what you say has been such a common experience of people involved in XR. I write about it in this little book, Extinction Rebellion: Insights from the Inside. I mean, one of the main themes of that book was the way that the experience of actually rebelling is so empowering, it's so positive, it's so prefigurative. It's what people find again and again. It's not universal, of course. Some people have had bad experiences, but it was overwhelming. And I'm no longer involved in the Extinction Rebellion. I've moved on, but the experience has left a positive mark in that kind of way, I think, on so many people who are involved with it. And that's got to say something positive. And secondly, yeah, absolutely, we're seeing some really massive positive silver linings in this absolute horror of the Ukraine situation. And one thing that reveals is this fascinating and important fact that if you ask people in opinion polls in countries like ours, what kind of person are you, what kind of values do you have, etc., people tend to give very, very strong and positive and green, etc. answers. And if you ask people, what do you think other people are like? What kind of values do you think other people have? The perception is a lot more negative. One crucial thing that needs to shift is we need to get people to understand that actually many more of us are pro-social and pro-ecological and willing to hold out a helping hand, etc. Many more of us are like that than typically we realize, and many more of us are like that than typically our media reflects back to us. And when we understand that, then I think forms of climate action, etc., become possible, which previously seemed impossible.
Thank you very much, Rupert. Do you have time for one more question? I know you're quite short on time as you're on to
One
somewhere
quickie,
else.
let's do it.
Mark, over to you.
Just a small detail came up in our discussion, Rupert, and in the timeline of eight years to net zero 2030 to to be net zero, do we need to overthrow capitalism first, or do we just go straight for some carbon taxing and big political pressure to get the big money to get with the program? And if we have to overthrow capitalism first, how many years is that going to take?
Well, thank you, Mark. Nice to see you. And I've got to be honest with you, as you well know, it's not a small question. I would defer partly to Jason in terms of the answer to the question. I think he gives some very good arguments in less is more around this. One thing I would say is I think we have to level with people and level with each other. That on the one hand, what we should be doing is achieving net zero carbon by 2030. But on the other hand, I think the chances of us actually doing so are absolutely negligible. Similarly, I think the chances of us holding temperatures to within 1.5 degrees are absolutely negligible. And the reason I think it's important to say this is because I think actually that horrifying knowledge paradoxically can help us rocket power ourselves into a whole nother level of action and activism, and is the only thing that could conceivably bring us close actually to achieving those targets. But anyway, my point in relation to your question there would be, given that we're not going to achieve carbon net zero by 2030, we can finesse the question slightly. We've got more time than that. I mean, we don't have more time than that in the sense that things are going to be, really awful and fucked and so on. But we do have more time in the sense that actually it's not going to be a question of we have to change everything in the next 8 years, because that isn't going to happen. So that may not be a fully satisfying answer, but that's my best answer I can give you in about a minute.
Thank you very much, Rupert, and very much appreciate you joining us for the last part of our call. And when your book is out, please share a link with me and I will pass it forward to everybody in the group.
I totally will do that. Cheers, Paul.
Brilliant. Thank you very much,
Good night,
Rupert.
everybody.
Good night.